The Galactic Council called it a diplomatic breakdown, humanity called it a necessary pause. The message arrived at 3:47 Universal Time Coordinated on a Tuesday. Not with fanfare. Not with the kind of atmospheric spectacle that humanity had spent decades imagining. No ships breaking through cloud cover, no booming transmissions that shook city blocks. It came through a relay station orbiting Titan, compressed into a tight beam signal that the automated monitoring array nearly flagged as interference noise. Nearly. Dr. Yel Okonkwo was the duty officer that night at the United Earth Communications Directorate, stationed in the quiet glass tower outside Geneva that most of the world didn't know existed. She had been 37 minutes into a cold cup of coffee and a reread of a stellar cartography paper when the alert tone sounded, 3 short pulses, a pause, then 2 long ones. That specific sequence had never triggered before. Not once in 11 years of operation. She set the coffee down very carefully. The signal, once unwrapped and cross-referenced against the Rosetta lexicon, the interspecies communication framework assembled over decades of quiet, painstaking work by Earth's xenolinguistics teams, resolved into something that took her breath away in its bureaucratic mundaneness. It was a summons. More precisely, it was a formal notification of convening, issued under the procedural code of an organization that called itself, in the closest human approximation, the Galactic Coordination Council. The GCC, as it would come to be known in every briefing room on Earth, was not a government. It was something older than that, a consensus body, a framework for dispute resolution and resource management among civilizations that had been navigating the same stars for thousands of years before humanity had invented writing. Earth was being invited to attend a session. The word invited would later become a subject of considerable diplomatic debate. By 6 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated, the secure conference line connecting Geneva to the Security Council annexes in New York, Beijing, Brussels, and Nairobi was operational. By 8:30, the first classified briefing packet had been assembled. By noon, the Secretary-General of the United Earth Directorate, a lean, methodical man named Kwame Asante who had spent his career in arms control negotiation, had read it twice and asked for a third copy to annotate personally. "Tell me what we actually know," he said to the room. "Not what we're inferring. Not what we're hoping. What we know." What they knew was limited but significant. The GCC had been aware of humanity for, at minimum, several hundred years. The signal contained embedded contextual data, not hidden but layered, the way a formal legal document carries its precedents and footnotes. Cross-referencing that data against Earth's own astronomical archives suggested that passive monitoring of the Sol system had begun sometime around the mid-1700s, when humanity's radio emissions first began to reach detectable range. They had been listening. They had not intervened. That restraint, the xenolinguistics team noted, was itself a message of sorts. The GCC operated on a principle of observed maturity. Civilizations were monitored, assessed, and only formally acknowledged when they demonstrated certain thresholds. The details of those thresholds were not provided. They were apparently considered self-evident. The session was scheduled for 60 days hence. Location: a neutral coordination platform in the outer system, coordinates provided. Attendance was described as expected. Not requested. Expected. Expected by whom? Asked Admiral Fatima Reyes, head of Earth's Joint Defense Coordination. She was not the only one in the room who noticed the phrasing. "That," said Dr. Okonkwo, who had been flown in from Geneva still wearing yesterday's clothes, "is exactly the right question." The 60-day window was not, as some later commentators would suggest, a generous gift of preparation time. It was, on reflection, a pressure mechanism, long enough to seem reasonable, short enough to prevent Earth from doing anything but react. Humanity, to its credit, recognized this immediately. The response was not panic. It was not celebration. What followed in those 60 days was something that rarely makes it into the historical narratives that prefer cleaner emotional arcs. It was a massive, grinding, extraordinarily expensive bureaucratic mobilization. Every xenolinguistics dataset ever compiled was cross-indexed. 42 competing theoretical models of non-human social structure were stress-tested against the signal's contextual data. The UED's legal team, in consultation with Earth's foremost specialists in international, now interstellar law, spent 3 weeks doing nothing but arguing about what expected attendance meant in the context of a body that had no jurisdictional authority over Earth under any legal framework that currently existed. That last point mattered more than it might seem. Because what Earth's analysts were building, quietly and carefully, was not just a diplomatic delegation. They were building a position. A set of principles. A legal and philosophical architecture that would define humanity's relationship with the GCC before anyone had shaken hands? Or whatever the equivalent gesture turned out to be. The core of that position was deceptively simple, and it had been articulated first not by a diplomat or a general, but by a historian named Dr. Priya Nair, who had been seconded to the analytical team from Cambridge. She put it this way in a memo that would later be read into the official record. We must be careful not to mistake notification for invitation, or invitation for obligation. The fact that the Council has chosen to acknowledge us is significant. The manner in which they have done so, unilaterally on their timeline with their framing, is equally significant, and should be understood as an opening negotiating position, not a neutral statement of fact. We should attend. We should be courteous, prepared, and genuinely willing to engage. But we should attend as ourselves, representing our interests on our terms, and we should make that clear from the first moment. The memo circulated. It was argued over. Parts of it were redacted. In the end, most of it survived. The delegation that assembled at Earth's new Deep Space Coordination Hub, constructed in a compressed 18-month project that had pushed the limits of every aerospace manufacturing consortium on the planet, was not large by the standards of interstellar politics. 14 people. 7 advisors. 2 translators. 1 admiral in a non-combat advisory role, because Secretary General Asante had been clear that Earth was attending a diplomatic session, not a military briefing. But attached to that small delegation, invisible in the data packets they carried, was the output of 60 days of the most intensive intellectual preparation in human history. Legal frameworks, precedent analysis, economic position papers. A detailed assessment of everything the GCC signals embedded data revealed about council structure, voting procedures, and historical dispute patterns. A list of 47 questions that Earth considered essential to answer before any binding agreement of any kind could be discussed. And a single-page document, classified at the highest level, that contained Earth's non-negotiable red lines. The things that were not on the table. The things that would not be discussed, conceded, or acknowledged as subject to outside authority. It was not a declaration of hostility. It was a declaration of selfhood. Dr. Nair had written the final line of that document, and Secretary General Asante had approved it without changing a word. Earth participates in this process as a sovereign civilization. We are here to understand and to be understood. We are not here to be administered. The delegation departed on day 58. On day 60 they arrived. And in the vast, ancient, precisely ordered chamber of the Galactic Coordination Council, humanity took its seat, quiet, prepared, and entirely clear about who they were. The council had expected attendance. They had perhaps not expected quite this kind of attendee. The coordination platform was not what anyone had expected, and several members of Earth's delegation would later note, in their private journals and formal debriefs alike, that this was probably intentional. It was not grand. It was not designed to intimidate through scale or spectacle. The structure, a rotating habitat approximately 4 kilometers in diameter, positioned at a stable gravitational null point beyond the orbit of Neptune, was functional in the way that old maritime law courts had been functional. Built for process, not for impression. The materials were unfamiliar, the geometry occasionally disorienting, but the fundamental logic of the space was readable. Corridors led to chambers. Chambers had seating. Seating was arranged in a way that implied, clearly, who was expected to speak and who was expected to listen. Earth's delegation noticed immediately which category they had been placed in. They were positioned, along with 3 other species whose representatives they had not yet been formally introduced to, in a curved gallery that overlooked the main floor of the chamber. It was not the back row, the architecture was too circular for that, but it was elevated and separated in a way that carried unmistakable symbolic weight. Observer status. Provisional presence. Secretary General Asante took his seat, adjusted his translation earpiece, and folded his hands on the small desk surface in front of him. He did not look at the gallery arrangement with any visible reaction. He had been an arms control negotiator for 20 years. He knew how rooms were designed to make you feel before anyone had said a word. Admiral Reyes, seated to his left in her dress uniform, specifically chosen for its lack of visible rank insignia beyond a small UED crest, because they had argued about this for 2 days and ultimately decided that projection of military identity was a variable they wanted to control carefully, leaned slightly toward him. "Observer gallery," she said quietly. "I noticed," he replied. "What's our move?" "We observe," he said. "For now." The session opened with what the translation matrix rendered as a recitation of standing, a formal accounting of each council member's recognized status, territory, and treaty relationships. It was long, methodical, the kind of procedural foundation laying that was deeply familiar to anyone who had ever sat through UN Security Council proceedings, except that it referenced star systems instead of nations, and the treaty relationships being cited stretched back, in some cases, thousands of years. Earth was not included in the recitation. This was not an oversight. Dr. Okonkwo, serving as the delegation's primary xenolinguistics analyst, tracked every reference and cross-indexed it against the briefing materials in real time. By the time the recitation concluded 40 minutes later, she had flagged 11 items for immediate review. The most significant was a structural one. The GCC, as best she could determine, operated on a principle it called recognized continuity, the idea that only civilizations with an unbroken record of interstellar presence above a certain threshold were accorded full participatory status. Earth, having achieved verifiable interstellar capability only within the last generation, was classified under a category that translated, imperfectly, as emerging presence. The practical implication of that classification she passed to Asante on a small physical note card. They had agreed not to use electronic communication during sessions, for reasons that the signals intelligence team had outlined at length, was significant. Emerging presences do not vote. They do not propose agenda items. They may submit written observations through a recognized member acting as sponsor. Earth didn't have a sponsor. No one had told them they needed one. The first substantive agenda item concerned something the translation matrix rendered as a resource boundary reaffirmation, a periodic review of agreed exploitation zones in a region of space that, as Dr. Okonkwo worked through the coordinates, encompassed a significant portion of the outer Oort cloud. Earth's Oort cloud. The discussion was conducted with complete procedural courtesy. Various member species made statements. A framework was referenced. Adjustments were proposed and noted. It was, in its way, an entirely ordinary piece of interstellar resource management, the kind of quiet administrative maintenance that kept complex multi-party relationships functional over long timescales. At no point did anyone address the human delegation. At no point did anyone ask whether Earth had a position on the boundaries being drawn around the outer edges of its own solar system. Asante wrote 3 words on his notepad. He underlined them once. They assumed consent. He passed the note to Admiral Reyes, who read it, set it down, and looked at the chamber floor below with an expression that she kept carefully neutral. The item concluded. A determination was recorded. The framework was updated. Earth had just, without being consulted or even formally notified, had its outer system's resource boundaries reaffirmed by an external body. The second agenda item was the one that had, ostensibly, prompted Earth's invitation, or rather, expected attendance. It concerned something called a civilizational integration assessment, which the translation matrix handled with somewhat less confidence, offering 3 possible renderings: integration review, orientation evaluation, or, most bluntly, compliance verification. A senior council member, one of the species whose biology rendered them, from a human perceptual standpoint, like the idea of a deep ocean creature adapted to open air, presented a document. It was transmitted to the delegation gallery along with translated summaries of its key provisions. Dr. Okonkwo read it in 4 minutes. Then she read it again. Then she wrote, in careful capital letters at the top of her working copy, "This is a membership application that presupposes we have already agreed to apply." The document contained 31 provisions. Among them, acknowledgement of GCC jurisdictional authority over interstellar commerce originating from Earth, adoption of GCC standardized communication protocols as the exclusive framework for contact with other species, submission of Earth's military and defense capability assessments to a council oversight body for review and potential limitation, and a commitment to resolve all future interspecies disputes through council arbitration mechanisms before taking any unilateral action. Provision 17 was the one that made Admiral Reyes put her pen down and look at the ceiling for a moment. It required Earth to provide, within 12 months of signing, a complete inventory of its conflict capacity, weapon systems, force projection capability, strategic doctrine, to be assessed for compatibility with Council stability standards. That was, in plain language, a demand to disclose Earth's entire military capability to a body Earth had met 6 hours ago. The presenting council member concluded their remarks and, for the first time in the session, addressed the delegation gallery directly. The translation matrix resolved the statement as, "Earth's formal response to the integration framework is welcomed for submission within 30 standard cycles." 30 standard cycles translated to approximately 42 Earth days. Asante stood. It was not a dramatic gesture. He stood the way a person stands when they have something specific to say and want to say it clearly, with the posture of someone who is not angry, not intimidated, and entirely certain of their position. "Thank you," he said, and waited for the translation to process. "Earth has received the integration framework document. We will review it thoroughly and respond formally within the time frame indicated." Pause. Carefully measured. "I would also like to formally note, for the Council's record, that Earth considers the resource boundary reaffirmation conducted earlier in this session, regarding the outer boundaries of our solar system, to have been conducted without Earth's knowledge, participation, or consent. We do not recognize that determination as binding on Earth until such time as we have had the opportunity to review and formally respond to it." The chamber was quiet in a way that had texture to it. "We appreciate the Council's patience," Asante said, and sat down. In the gallery no one spoke for a moment. Then Dr. Nair, who had said almost nothing for 6 hours, leaned forward slightly and made a note in her journal. "Day 1. They know we're here now." The delegation returned to Earth not in triumph and not in crisis, but in something that experienced diplomats recognize as the most demanding emotional register of all: sustained, deliberate uncertainty. They had not signed anything. They had not refused anything. They had noted their objection to one procedural breach and requested time to review the integration framework. By any formal measure, the session had concluded without incident. And yet, in the secure debriefing room on the Deep Space Hub, before the return transit even began, Asante had looked around the table at his 14-person delegation and said something that none of them forgot. "What we just experienced was not a diplomatic opening. It was a diagnostic. They were watching how we responded to being placed in a subordinate position, handed a pre-written agreement, and told to sign within 42 days. Everything, the gallery seating, the resource boundary item, the specific language of the framework, was calibrated. They wanted to see what kind of civilization we are. You let that sit. So let's make sure our response tells them accurately." The 30-day review, it became known by that name internally, though the actual timeline stretched to the full 42 days and then formally beyond, was organized with a precision that reflected both the gravity of the situation and a hard-learned lesson from the session itself. Earth had been caught flat-footed on the resource boundary question. Not because the analytical team hadn't been thorough, they had been extraordinarily thorough, but because they had been focused on preparing for what they expected the session to contain. They had prepared for a first contact negotiation. They had gotten, instead, an administrative session in which they were a late agenda item. That would not happen again. The review was structured into 7 parallel working groups, each assigned a specific segment of the integration framework's 31 provisions. Legal analysis, economic implications, military and defense considerations, scientific and technological exchange protocols, communication standards, jurisdictional scope. And what the 7th group, staffed with historians, anthropologists, and political theorists, called the structural analysis team, tasked with understanding not what the provisions said but what they assumed. That 7th group turned out to be the most important. Dr. Nair led the structural analysis team, and the document she presented on day 14 of the review process remains, even now, one of the most quietly consequential pieces of writing in human diplomatic history. It was titled, simply, "What the Integration Framework Presupposes." The opening paragraph set the tone. The integration framework is not a negotiation. It is a template. The same document, or a document structurally identical to it, has almost certainly been presented to every emerging present species that has ever sat in the observer gallery of the GCC. Its 31 provisions are not specific to Earth. They are generic placeholders calibrated for a particular type of new entrant. One that has interstellar capability but limited institutional independence, one that is grateful for acknowledgement and anxious for acceptance. The document assumes a psychology of arrival, not a psychology of sovereignty. She went on to identify 7 core presuppositions embedded in the framework structure. First, that Earth would accept GCC jurisdictional categories without questioning their basis in any law applicable to Earth. Second, that interstellar commerce was a category Earth already participated in and would naturally seek to regulate cooperatively. Third, that Earth's military capability was a legitimate subject of external review, not a matter of sovereignty but of collective safety management. Fourth, that Earth had no existing interspecies relationships that might complicate a clean integration process. Fifth, that the 42-day timeline was adequate for meaningful review, thereby normalizing a rushed process. Sixth, that Earth would seek Council sponsorship, and would therefore be in debt to whichever member species agreed to serve that role. And seventh, the most fundamental presupposition of all, that Earth wanted membership in the GCC, and that this desire was strong enough to function as leverage. That last point, Dr. Nair argued, was the frame that all the others depended on. Remove it, and the entire architecture of the framework became negotiable. The military implications of Provision 17, the capability disclosure requirement, were analyzed by a team led by Admiral Reyes, working in close consultation with the UED Joint Chiefs and a select group of defense ministers from Earth's major powers. The classified summary of that analysis, portions of which have since been declassified, was direct. Provision 17, if complied with, would provide any GCC member with access to a comprehensive assessment of Earth's defense posture. There is no mechanism within the framework to limit how this information is used, shared, or acted upon by Council members. There is no reciprocal disclosure requirement. There is no audit mechanism for the compatibility assessment process, meaning its criteria could be applied arbitrarily. In short, Provision 17 would provide a significant intelligence advantage to any party that could influence the oversight body's findings. We recommend non-compliance in its current form. The economic analysis reached a similar conclusion about the commerce provisions. The Communication Standards Group noted that adopting GCC protocols as exclusive rather than primary frameworks would create a functional dependency on Council infrastructure for all interstellar contact, effectively giving the GCC a switch on Earth's ability to communicate with the rest of the galaxy. Each working group produced the same fundamental finding, expressed in the specific vocabulary of their domain. The framework was not designed to include Earth as an equal. It was designed to include Earth as a managed variable. On day 38, Asante convened a plenary session of all 7 working groups together, along with the Security Council representatives who had been silent observers throughout the review process. He asked each group lead to state their core finding in a single sentence. Legal, the framework's jurisdictional claims have no basis in any law to which Earth is a party. Economic, the commerce provisions would create dependency before any benefit could be realized. Military, Provision 17 is not a safety measure. It is a collection mechanism. Scientific, the exchange protocols are one-directional, we provide data, they provide access. The access is not defined. Communications, exclusive protocol adoption is a structural vulnerability dressed as a cooperation standard. Structural analysis, the document assumes we want to belong more than we want to be ourselves. And the 6th group lead, Dr. Arjun Mehta, who had spent his career in international trade law before pivoting to interstellar policy, said something that landed in the room with the weight of a door closing. Every provision in this document is written for a civilization that arrived hoping to be accepted. We need to respond as a civilization that arrived prepared to participate, on terms we have also considered. Asante nodded slowly. Then that's what we write, he said. The response document took 11 days to draft, review, redraft, argue over, redraft again and finalize. It was not a refusal. Asante had been explicit about that from the beginning. A refusal would be read as a failure of will, a sign that Earth was not ready for engagement. That was not the message. The response was a counter-framework. 31 provisions addressed one by one. For each one, Earth's position was stated clearly. Accept with modification, require clarification before consideration, or not applicable as written. 17 provisions fell into the first 2 categories. Humanity was not opposed to cooperation, communication standards, scientific exchange, or dispute resolution mechanisms. Those things were reasonable. Those things Earth was genuinely interested in. 8 provisions required clarification, specific, detailed clarification on scope, reciprocity, and implementation criteria that the framework had left undefined. 6 provisions were marked not applicable as written, including Provision 17. For each of those, Earth had drafted alternative language that addressed the stated purpose of the provision without creating the structural vulnerabilities the original contained. The document closed with a single additional provision, one Earth had added, not one it was responding to. It proposed that any agreement reached between Earth and the GCC be subject to a 5-year review period, during which both parties would retain the right to revisit any provision based on observed implementation. Not a withdrawal clause. A maturation clause. The language of a party that expected to be in a long relationship and wanted to build it correctly, not quickly. On day 4-3, 1 day past the Council's stated deadline, the document was transmitted. Along with it, a formal note signed by Secretary General Asante, acknowledging that the response was 1 day late and explaining without apology that Earth had required the full time to be thorough, and thoroughness was something Earth considered non-negotiable in agreements of this scope. The note also formally requested an extension of the review timeline for the outstanding resource boundary question, which Earth had not yet formally acknowledged or disputed, and which Earth considered a prerequisite item requiring resolution before the integration framework process could proceed. It was, in diplomatic terms, a very polite way of saying, "We haven't forgotten, we're not letting it go, and we'd like to talk about it before we talk about anything else." The Council's reply came 14 days later. It was a single line, rendered through the translation matrix with careful precision. The Council notes Earth's response and will convene a secondary session. Attendance is expected. Same phrase. Same word. Expected. But something in the transmission metadata, a detail that Earth Signals team flagged and that Dr. Okonkwo spent 3 hours analyzing, suggested that the response had taken longer to send than the first summons had. The Council had deliberated. That, she concluded in her analysis report, was the first real piece of information they had received about how the Council actually worked. When they sent the first summons, she wrote, they didn't think twice. We were a routine new entrant. When they received our response, they had to think. We are no longer routine. That is a meaningful change. The secondary session was different from the first in ways that began before anyone entered the chamber. Earth's delegation arrived at the coordination platform 12 hours early. Not as a tactical gesture, though it was one, but because Asante had decided, after 3 days of conversation with Dr. Nair and the structural analysis team, that preparation time on site was something they could not replicate from briefing packets alone. They needed to be in the space. They needed to understand its rhythms, its personnel flows, which corridors connected to which chambers, how long the translation systems took to process complex compound statements, and, perhaps most importantly, who else was there and what they were doing. What the delegation found in those 12 hours was instructive. There were, by their count, representatives of at least 11 other species present on the platform. Most were engaged in the ordinary business of a functioning interstellar coordination body, trade framework discussions, boundary maintenance reviews, a quiet mediation between two parties whose dispute, from the brief overheard fragments the translation system could parse, seemed to involve mineral extraction rights on a system 200 light-years away. It was, in other words, a working institution. It had its own internal culture, its own rhythms, its own social architecture. It had been operating, in various forms, for longer than human civilization had been literate. That context mattered. Earth was not walking into a confrontation. It was walking into an organization with a great deal of institutional inertia, staffed by beings who had processed thousands of integration frameworks and who would, professionally speaking, prefer that Earth's response not create additional work. Dr. Mehta had summarized this dynamic in a pre-session briefing note. Bureaucratic friction is not hostility. It is, however, a force that shapes outcomes. Our goal is not to fight the institution. It is to make our position legible to it, to translate our counter-framework into language the institution can process without treating us as a malfunction. The session opened with a shift that Earth's delegation noted immediately. They were still in the gallery. But the small desk surfaces had been upgraded, slightly larger with integrated translation interfaces rather than the standalone earpieces they'd used in the first session. A minor adjustment. But minor adjustments in formal diplomatic settings are not accidents. The presiding council member, a different individual from the first session, which Dr. Okonkwo flagged as potentially significant, addressed the gallery directly at the outset. The translation matrix rendered the opening. This session is convened to address Earth's formal response to the integration framework. The Council acknowledges receipt. 17 provisions are noted as accepted or conditionally accepted. 8 provisions are marked as requiring clarification. 6 provisions have been returned with alternative formulations. The Council will address each category. It was precise. It was professional. It was the response of an institution that had, in fact, read Earth's counter-framework carefully. Asante had prepared for 2 possibilities. The first was dismissal, a refusal to engage with the counter-framework as a legitimate document, an insistence that the original framework was non-negotiable, a return to the pressure of the original timeline. The second was engagement, a genuine, procedurally grounded response that treated Earth's counterproposal as a working document. The Council was doing the second. That was, in itself, a significant data point. The clarification session on the 8 flag provisions was, by any measure, the most technically demanding diplomatic exchange in human history. It lasted 9 hours across 2 days, with both sides presenting through the translation matrix in careful, precise language designed to minimize ambiguity. What emerged was revealing. On 5 of the 8 provisions, the Council's clarifications resolved Earth's concerns substantively. The commerce provisions, it turned out, were largely administrative in nature, designed to establish common record-keeping formats rather than cede jurisdictional authority. The scientific exchange protocols were more reciprocal than the original language had implied. The asymmetry Earth had identified reflected a default assumption that emerging presences had less to contribute, not a structural intent to exploit. That assumption, Earth's delegation noted, was itself a problem, but it was a different problem than what they had initially identified and a more tractable one. On 3 provisions, the Council's clarifications confirmed Earth's concerns. The communication standards exclusivity requirement was, the presiding member acknowledged, standard practice. And standard practice was, as Earth had articulated, a dependency structure. The Council did not, apparently, consider this problematic. Earth did. That disagreement was logged formally and set aside for later resolution. The capability disclosure provision was handled separately, and by a different Council representative, a shift in speaker that Dr. Nair identified as significant, suggesting that Provision 17 was politically sensitive within the Council as well as outside it. The new representative's position, as translated, was this: the capability assessment process was not an intelligence collection mechanism. It was a stability verification tool. The Council's concern was not Earth's defense posture per se, but the potential for an unassessed military capability to create instability in a region of space where multiple established civilizations had overlapping interests. It was, Asante acknowledged privately, a legitimate concern. Stated directly, it was a reasonable thing for an interstellar coordination body to be interested in. He said as much in the chamber. We understand the Council's stability interests, he said, and we share them. Earth has no interest in being a destabilizing force in this region. However, the mechanism proposed, a unilateral disclosure to a body whose assessment criteria and membership are not fully transparent to us, is not one we can accept. We would propose instead a mutual framework, a joint assessment process, conducted with full transparency on both sides, with criteria agreed upon before the process begins rather than applied during it. A pause while the translation matrix worked. We are prepared to be assessed. We are not prepared to be assessed without understanding the standards. The response from the Council side of the chamber took 14 minutes. During those 14 minutes, the delegation gallery was quiet. Dr. Okonkwo watched the main floor below and noted, without comment, that there appeared to be a consultation happening among the Council members, not a formal procedural moment, but a quieter, sideways kind of conversation, the kind that happens when something unexpected has been said. The presiding member's eventual response was translated as, the Council will take Earth's proposal regarding the assessment framework under advisement. Not a yes. Not a no. The language of an institution that needed to think. The 6 alternative provisions were addressed on the second day. The Council's response to Earth's rewrites ranged from straightforward acceptance to careful resistance. The alternative language for the commerce provisions was accepted with minor modifications. The alternative framework for scientific exchange was accepted in principle, with details to be negotiated. 2 of the 6 alternates were accepted outright, which Asante later called the most encouraging moment of the entire process, because it confirmed that the framework was, in fact, negotiable, which some within the Council had implied was not the case. The remaining 2 were contested. One was the communication standards provision. Earth's alternative language proposed primary rather than exclusive adoption of GCC protocols, retaining Earth's ability to develop and use its own communication standards as a secondary system. The Council's position was that dual systems created verification problems. Earth's position was that exclusive systems created dependency. Neither side moved significantly on this point, and it was formally tabled for a third session. The other was Earth's own additional provision, the 5-year review clause. This one produced the longest single exchange of the 2-day session. The Council's initial position was that review clauses were unusual and potentially destabilizing. If integration agreements were subject to periodic renegotiation, they could not function as stable frameworks. Earth's response, delivered by Dr. Mehta, was measured and precise. Every agreement Earth has ever entered into, every treaty, every trade framework, every security arrangement, has included review mechanisms. Not because those agreements were expected to fail, but because the parties entering them understood that relationships evolve, circumstances change, and frameworks built without adaptation mechanisms tend to become sources of friction rather than resolution. The review clause is not a withdrawal option. It is a maintenance mechanism. We would suggest that the Council, which has been maintaining complex multi-party relationships for thousands of years, understands the value of maintenance. Another consultation on the chamber floor. The review clause was accepted in modified form, a 7-year period rather than 5, with specific procedural constraints on which provisions could be revisited and under what circumstances. Earth accepted the modification. At the close of the second session, the presiding council member addressed the gallery with a statement that the translation matrix rendered, after a longer processing pause than usual, as something that carried, in the original, what appeared to be an idiomatic quality, the approximate human equivalent of a genuine compliment delivered in the formal register of an official proceeding. The Council finds Earth's engagement with the integration framework to be detailed and considered. The Council will prepare a revised framework document incorporating agreed modifications and will transmit it for Earth's review within 20 standard cycles. 20 standard cycles. Approximately 28 Earth days. As the delegation prepared to depart, Admiral Reyes fell into step beside Asante in the corridor. "We moved them," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. We gave them something to work with," he replied. "That's different from moving them." "But yes, we moved them." She nodded slowly. "And the resource boundary question?" Asante smiled, a small, tired expression. "We haven't forgotten. Neither have they." The revised integration framework arrived 26 days after the second session. It was, by objective measure, significantly better than the original. 16 of the 31 provisions had been substantively modified, and Earth's 5-year review clause was present, adjusted to 7 years exactly as agreed. But there was something else in the document that had not been discussed. Something that appeared, on first reading, to be a minor administrative addition, a preamble clause that had not been present in the original framework. Dr. Okonkwo identified it within the first hour of the translation review. She sent a single message to Asante's secure channel: "Read the preamble." Third paragraph. Specifically the clause beginning with, "in recognition of." You read it? Then he called a full working group session for the following morning. The preamble clause, translated as carefully and as precisely as the xenolinguistics team could manage, stated the following. "In recognition of Earth's status as an emerging presence within the space of the Galactic Coordination Council's established framework, and in acknowledgement of Earth's expressed willingness to engage with the integration process, the parties to this agreement affirm Earth's understanding that the boundaries, relationships, and precedents established within Council-recognized space prior to Earth's formal engagement represent the baseline upon which this agreement is constructed." It was one sentence. 68 words in translation. And what it did, with bureaucratic precision, was transform the resource boundary reaffirmation from the first session, the one Earth had formally objected to, the one that had been set aside as a prerequisite question, into an acknowledged baseline. If Earth signed the revised framework with that preamble in place, it would be, in effect, retroactively consenting to the boundary determination it had explicitly refused to acknowledge. It was not a crude maneuver. It was sophisticated. It was exactly the kind of thing that gets missed by delegations focused on the substantive provisions and not the structural language that frames them. It was, Dr. Nair said in the working group session, proof that the Council had done its own structural analysis of Earth's position. "They know we flagged the boundary question as a prerequisite," she said. "This is their answer to that. They're not resolving the question, they're absorbing it, making it a baseline assumption rather than an open issue. So if we sign," started Dr. Mehta, "we've resolved the question in their favor without ever having a conversation about it." The working group was quiet for a moment. "What's our response?" someone asked. Asante had been sitting at the end of the table, reading the preamble clause again. He put the document down. "We don't sign," he said. "Not this version. And we tell them exactly why." Earth's response to the revised framework was transmitted 15 days later. It was not an angry document. It was, in tone and structure, the most formal thing Earth's delegation had produced, precise, specific, and entirely unambiguous. It identified the preamble clause. It explained, in careful legal language, exactly what the clause accomplished structurally. It noted that this addition had not been discussed in either session, had not been proposed by Earth, and represented a substantive change to the scope of the agreement, not an administrative modification, and therefore required discussion before any further progress on the framework itself could proceed. And then it included a phrase that had been argued over for 3 days within the delegation, and that had ultimately been approved by Secretary General Asante on the recommendation of every working group lead unanimously. Earth is prepared to continue this process in good faith. Earth is not prepared to continue this process on terms that treat unresolved prerequisite questions as resolved. We therefore propose a pause in the integration framework process until the resource boundary question can be addressed in a dedicated session, with full participation and discussion rights for Earth. We believe this sequencing will produce a stronger and more durable agreement. We are committed to reaching such an agreement. Pause. Not a withdrawal. Not a refusal. A sequencing request with reasons attached and a commitment to return. The Council's response came faster than any previous communication. 6 days, by far the shortest interval in the entire process. And it came not as a formal transmission through the standard relay, but as a direct communication from the Council's senior coordination officer, the first time that role had been involved in Earth's process at all. The translation matrix labeled the transmission with a status flag it had not used before. Priority, protocol deviation. The message in full: the Council notes Earth's suspension of the integration process. The Council characterizes this action as a diplomatic breakdown under Framework Protocol 7, which requires formal notification to all member species and initiates a mediation procedure. Earth is requested to reconsider its position. Diplomatic breakdown. The phrase was specific, procedural, and carried weight. Framework Protocol 7, once triggered, apparently set a clock running on a formal mediation process that had its own timeline and its own set of pressures. Earth's delegation read the transmission, cross-referenced Framework Protocol 7 against the institutional documentation they had assembled, and prepared a response. It was sent within 48 hours. Earth notes the Council's characterization. Earth respectfully disagrees with the framing. Earth has not broken down a diplomatic process. Earth has requested that a diplomatic process proceed in the correct sequence. We have proposed a pause. We have explained our reasons. We remain committed to the process and to the relationship. We do not accept that requesting proper sequencing constitutes a breakdown. We would, however, welcome the opportunity to discuss this disagreement in a dedicated session, which we note would itself be an example of the kind of process we are advocating for. The distinction between breakdown and pause became, in the weeks that followed, the central axis of the dispute. It was not a semantic argument, or rather, it was not merely a semantic argument. The Council's characterization as a breakdown triggered Protocol 7, which activated mediation procedures, which created timeline pressures and brought in additional Council members as formal parties to the process. Earth's characterization as a pause asserted that the process was ongoing, that Earth remained engaged, and that the appropriate response was to address Earth's concerns rather than escalate the procedural stakes. Which framing prevailed would determine the entire structure of what came next. Dr. Nair's analysis, prepared for internal circulation, was blunt. The Council has chosen a frame that puts Earth on the defensive. We are the party that broke down the process, the party that must be mediated back to the table. This frame benefits the Council because it positions their framework as the stable baseline and our objections as the disruption. Our frame, pause, positions the framework as incomplete and our objections as the reason for incompletion. These are not equivalent starting points for a mediation. Earth held its position. Publicly, through every formal channel, Earth's characterization of events was consistent. This was a pause requested for specific reasons with a clear path to resumption. Asante gave a single public statement, cleared for release through the UED's official communications office. Earth is engaged in a process with the Galactic Coordination Council that we take seriously and that we intend to see reach a productive conclusion. We have raised concerns about the sequencing of the process. We believe those concerns are legitimate and that addressing them will produce a better outcome for both parties. We are not walking away from the table. We are asking that the table be properly set before we sit down. The statement was measured. It was non-inflammatory. It was designed for two audiences simultaneously, the Council and Earth's own population, which had now been fully briefed on the process and was watching with the mixture of anxiety, pride, and careful attention that a species tends to bring to its first significant test on an interstellar stage. What happened in the 6 weeks following was not what anyone, inside or outside Earth's delegation, had fully anticipated. The Council triggered Protocol 7. The mediation clock began. But 3 of the Council's member species, not identified publicly, but tracked through signals analysis by Earth's monitoring teams, made separate, unofficial contact with Earth's relay station at Titan. The messages were brief and varied in their framing. but their common thread was unmistakable. Each of them, in different language and different registers, said some version of the same thing. Your resource boundary objection is correct, and you are not the first emerging presence to have raised it. The 3 unofficial contacts arrived within a 9-day window, staggered in a way that Earth's signals team determined was almost certainly deliberate, not coordinated among the 3 parties, but separately calculated to avoid the appearance of a block. None of the communications identified their senders by name, species, or council position. They came through relay architectures that the GCC's own internal protocols technically classified as secondary channels. Not private exactly, but not part of the formal record that Protocol 7 mediation proceedings would review. Whoever was reaching out had done so in a way that was deniable. That deniability was itself a message. Earth's intelligence analysis team spent 48 hours on the 3 contacts before producing an assessment. The signals forensics were inconclusive on specific sender identification. The routing architecture was sophisticated, and the team was working with a very limited baseline of interstellar communication pattern data. But the content analysis was more tractable. The 3 messages, stripped of their specific linguistic and cultural markers, contained 3 different kinds of information. The first was validation. The resource boundary objection was procedurally sound. Not unprecedented. There was language in the GCC's own foundational documents, the ones that were not included in the integration framework package sent to Earth, that provided for mandatory consultation with affected parties before boundary determinations affecting their star systems could be recorded as binding. The second was context. The preamble clause in the revised framework was a known mechanism. It had been used before. At least 2 previous emerging presences had signed integration frameworks containing similar baseline absorption language without recognizing what they were agreeing to. The outcomes had been, in both cases, a gradual narrowing of those civilizations' ability to contest subsequent boundary determinations. The third message contained something different entirely. Not validation or context, but a question, framed as a rhetorical observation but unmistakable in its intent. It is noted that Earth's response to the integration framework included language regarding mutual transparency in capability assessments. No previous emerging presence has proposed such a clause. The Council's response to this proposal has not been publicly disclosed. Those with interests in the outcomes of stability assessment processes find this observation relevant. Dr. Okonkwo presented the analysis to the working group with characteristic precision, and then did something uncharacteristic. She paused before the final section and looked around the table. I want to be careful about how I frame this, she said. We're working with limited data, imperfect translation, and an almost complete lack of context for the internal politics of a body that's been operating for thousands of years. Everything I'm about to say should be held with appropriate uncertainty. She continued. The 3 contacts, in her assessment, represented not a unified position but a convergence of separate interests. Within the GCC, there appeared to be factions, not formalized but present, whose interests diverged from those of the members who had drafted the integration framework. Some of those factions had, historically, opposed the boundary determination processes that had now become central to Earth's dispute. Others were more interested in the capability assessment question than in the boundary issue. The message about Provision 17, she said, is the most interesting. Someone in the Council, or adjacent to it, is watching how the capability assessment question resolves. They're interested in the mutual transparency proposal specifically. That suggests that the assessment process, as currently structured, creates an information asymmetry that benefits some Council members more than others. Which means, said Dr. Nair slowly, that when we pushed back on Provision 17, we may have inadvertently surfaced an internal Council dispute. That's my read. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment. So we're not just in a bilateral negotiation, said Admiral Reyes. We're in a multilateral situation with internal dynamics we don't fully understand, and at least some parties within those dynamics think Earth's position is useful to them. Useful to them in ways we haven't been told, Asante added. He turned to Dr. Okonkwo. Can we identify what they want from us? Not with confidence. But I can tell you what each of the 3 contact patterns suggests they value. The first sender seems primarily interested in procedural legitimacy. They want the resource boundary process fixed. The second is harder to read, but the historical context they provided was very specifically about the long-term trajectory of civilizations that signed baseline absorption clauses. That's a warning, but it's also possibly an invitation. If we push back successfully, we create a precedent. The third is about Provision 17, and that one I genuinely can't fully characterize without more information. Asante nodded. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. We need to be very careful here, he said. We have no idea how deep these internal dynamics go, who the other parties are, or what their actual interests are. Using this information to play factions against each other could backfire catastrophically if we misread it, but ignoring it would be equally wrong. He made a decision. We don't use it to maneuver. We use it to calibrate. We know now that our resource boundary position is legitimately grounded, that there's language in the GCC's own foundational documents to support it. We cite that directly in the formal response. We demonstrate that we've done our research, without revealing how we got pointed toward what to research. Dr. Mehta smiled slightly. We show our work, not our sources. Exactly. Earth's formal response to the Protocol 7 mediation initiation was transmitted on day 44 of the pause, and it was the longest, most meticulously sourced document the delegation had produced. It opened with a clear restatement of Earth's position. The pause was a sequencing request, not a breakdown. Earth remained committed to the process, and Earth proposed that the mediation session be structured to address the resource boundary question as its primary agenda item, before returning to the integration framework. Then came the section that had taken 3 days to write and had been reviewed by every working group simultaneously. Earth cited, directly and with full reference coordinates, the foundational GCC document language that established mandatory consultation requirements for boundary determinations affecting active star systems. The language had come, nominally, from the contextual data embedded in the original summons, the footnoted precedents that the working group had been analyzing for months. But the specific provision had only been located after the first unofficial contact had pointed Earth's researchers toward the right section of the archive. The citation was accurate. The source officially was Earth's own research. The argument was straightforward. The resource boundary reaffirmation conducted in the first session had not followed the Council's own established procedures. Earth had not been consulted. Earth's consultation right existed within the Council's own foundational framework. Therefore, the determination was procedurally invalid, regardless of its substance, and the preamble clause in the revised integration framework, which attempted to establish that determination as a baseline, was built on a procedurally invalid foundation. Earth was not asking for a special exception. Earth was asking the Council to follow its own rules. The mediation session convened 20 days later. The composition of the chamber was different from any previous session. The gallery was reconfigured. Still present, still elevated, but the separation between gallery and floor was less pronounced. The translation interfaces were integrated directly into the main chamber architecture, and there were additional representatives present whose status the translation matrix classified as observer with standing, a category that, as best Earth's team could determine, indicated parties with formal interest in the proceedings but not primary standing. Someone within the Council had requested that classification for the mediation. Earth didn't know who. But the presence of multiple interested observers changed the dynamic of the room in ways that Asante, watching from his newly positioned seat, found instructive. They're watching us, Admiral Reyes said quietly. Some of them are watching the Council, Asante replied. Which is just as interesting. The mediation was chaired by a Council member who had not appeared in either previous session. A deliberate neutrality signal, Earth's team assessed. The opening statement confirmed that the session would address, as its primary item, the procedural validity of the resource boundary reaffirmation. Earth had asked for this. Earth had gotten it. Now Earth had to make its case to a body that had been running interstellar administration since before Rome existed, using a legal argument built on that body's own foundational documents, in front of an audience that included, somewhere in the observer gallery, at least 3 parties who had communicated privately with Earth for reasons that Earth still didn't fully understand. Dr. Nair leaned toward Asante as the presiding member called the session to order. How do you feel? She asked. Prepared, he said. And then, after a moment, and appropriately uncertain. She nodded. Good. That's the correct amount. What followed was 6 hours of the most consequential legal argument in human history. Earth presented its case methodically. The foundational document citation. The procedural requirements. The timeline of the first session, establishing that consultation had not occurred. The preamble clause analysis, showing that the revised framework had attempted to resolve the issue indirectly rather than address it. The Council's procedural defense was competent but visibly uncomfortable. There were internal consultations, translation delays that seemed longer than the technical requirements would explain, and at one point a 20-minute recess that was not announced in advance. When the presiding member delivered the session's preliminary finding, it was worded with extreme care. The Council acknowledges that the procedural requirements pertaining to boundary determinations and systems with active emerging civilizations were not applied in the manner described in the foundational documents during the first coordination session. The Council will initiate an internal procedural review. The resource boundary reaffirmation will be placed in an interim status pending that review. Earth will be formally included in any subsequent determination process as a consultation right holder. It was not an apology. It was not a full concession. But it was something that no emerging presence, as far as Earth's limited historical data could determine, had ever received before. It was the Council admitting, in formal procedural language, that it had not followed its own rules. The final integration framework session was scheduled 60 days after the mediation's preliminary finding. In those 60 days, the resource boundary question was formally reopened. Earth participated in the review process as a consultation right holder, the first emerging presence to hold that classification during an active boundary determination. The technical review involved detailed analysis of the outer Oort cloud's resource characteristics, the competing interests of two established council members whose agreed zones overlapped with the region in question, and Earth's own assessment of its interests in the outer system. Earth's position on the substance was modest. The delegation had discussed this at length, and the consensus had been consistent. Earth's goal was not to maximize territorial claim or resource control. Earth didn't have the infrastructure to exploit the outer Oort cloud in any meaningful way for generations. The point was the principle: the right to be consulted, the right to have its interests formally acknowledged, the right to participate in decisions that affected its home system. The final boundary determination, reached by consensus after 4 formal consultation sessions in which Earth's delegation participated, differed from the original reaffirmation in several specific ways. 2 of the adjustments were substantive. They created a designated consultation buffer zone around Earth's solar system that required Earth's formal input before any resource extraction activities could be conducted within it. The other adjustments were largely procedural, establishing Earth's consultation rights in explicit, referenceable terms. It was not a dramatic outcome. It did not give Earth vast new resources or strategic advantages. But it was Earth's name in a GCC foundational document, attached to specific rights, established through a process that had followed the rules. Dr. Nair, reviewing the final determination text, said something to her working group that later found its way into the official historical record. Every emerging presence that comes after us, and there will be others, now has a precedent. The consultation right holder classification didn't exist in active use before this. We didn't create it. It was always in the foundational documents. We just made them use it. The revised integration framework, 5th version, was transmitted to Earth 3 weeks before the final session. It was, compared to the original, a substantially different document. 15 provisions had been modified in ways that reflected the negotiations of the previous sessions. The preamble clause was gone, replaced with language that explicitly acknowledged the separate resolution of the resource boundary question and noted that the integration framework did not constitute a resolution of any other prerequisite matters not specifically listed. The communication standards provision retained the primary rather than exclusive language Earth had proposed. The capability assessment provision, Provision 17, had been restructured to include a mutual transparency framework. Both Earth and the Council's oversight body would disclose the criteria, methodology, and review process before any assessment began, and Earth would have the right to propose modifications to the methodology before agreeing to participate. It was not the complete mutual disclosure that Earth had originally proposed. But it was a framework in which Earth knew what it was agreeing to before it agreed to it. The 7-year review clause was present, unchanged. Earth's working groups reviewed the document over a period of 18 days. The legal team found no new preamble-style absorption mechanisms. The economic team cleared the commerce provisions. The military and defense team reviewed Provision 17's revised structure and, after extensive internal deliberation, noted that they had concerns about several operational specifics of the mutual assessment methodology, but that those concerns were workable within the framework as written, and that the framework's transparency requirements were sufficient to prevent the information asymmetry they had originally flagged. The structural analysis team's final note was characteristically concise. This document is not perfect. No document of this scope and complexity could be. What it is honest, both about what it establishes and about what it leaves open. The 7-year review clause will matter. We should be prepared to use it. On the morning of the final session, Asante convened the delegation one last time before they entered the chamber. He didn't have prepared remarks. He had made that decision deliberately. He had been living in prepared remarks for the better part of 2 years, and he wanted this moment to be different. I want to say something about what we've done, he started, and what we haven't done. Because I think both matter. He looked around the table. We haven't secured humanity's position in this galaxy. We haven't made Earth safe or powerful, or established in any permanent sense. We've signed an agreement with an institution we still understand imperfectly, with parties whose interests we can't fully map, under conditions that will change in ways we can't predict. The 7-year review is going to matter. The precedents we've set are going to matter. And the things we still don't know, about the Council, about the species we've met and the ones we haven't, about what's actually happening in the space between stars, those are going to matter more than anything we've agreed to today. He paused. What we have done is this: we showed up. We read everything. We asked the questions no one expected us to ask. We pushed back on things that were wrong, and we did it with reasons, not demands. We found common ground where it existed, and we were honest about where it didn't. We made the institution use its own rules. And we made it clear from the first session to this one, that Earth is not here to be managed. We're here to participate. Admiral Reyes spoke from across the table. And the capability assessment? The military's still not fully comfortable with it. Neither am I, Asante said. But uncomfortable and wrong are different things. The transparency framework makes it workable. And the review clause means that if we're wrong about that, we have a mechanism to correct it. He stood. Let's go sign a document. The final session was the shortest of all, 94 minutes. The ceremony was modest, which Earth had requested and the Council had accommodated. The presiding member, the same individual who had chaired the mediation, presented the 5th framework for formal signature by Earth's delegation head. Asante signed it with a stylus that transmitted the signature through the translation interface into whatever the GCC's record-keeping system used. He had no idea what the signature looked like on their end. It probably didn't look anything like his name. The thought, in the moment, struck him as oddly comforting. A reminder of how genuinely, fundamentally different this all was and how much work remained. There was no applause. There were no handshakes. The biology of the chamber's other occupants made that a non-universal gesture, and Earth's delegation had been briefed at length on the etiquette of multi-species formal settings. There was a formal acknowledgement from the presiding member, translated as something between duly noted and welcome, with a nuance the xenolinguistics team would spend months debating. And then it was done. 41 days later, back on Earth, Secretary General Asante gave a public address that was broadcast in 47 languages and watched by more people than any other single event in human history. He did not describe it as a victory. He was consistent on this point across every subsequent interview, briefing, and historical consultation. We established a relationship, he said. A real one, not a convenient fiction. Relationships of this kind are not won or lost. They are built, maintained, tested, and sometimes repaired. We've done the first part. We have to be prepared for all the others. The questions he was most frequently asked in the months that followed were some version of the same thing. Were the other species friendly? Were they dangerous? Should humanity be afraid? His answer, adjusted for each questioner but consistent in its core, was this. The galaxy is not friendly or unfriendly. It is occupied by civilizations with their own interests, their own histories, their own fears and ambitions. Some of those interests align with ours. Some of them don't. What we've established is a framework for navigating that reality with our eyes open. That's the beginning of something. It's not the end of anything. Dr. Nair's final journal entry from the process, written on the return transit from the coordination platform after the signing, was not included in any official document. She published it herself, several years later, as part of a collection of essays about the integration process. It read in full. We did not impress them. I want to be clear about that because I've already heard people saying we did and it's the wrong story. What we did was something more durable than impressive. We were legible. We showed up as something specific, with principles they could read, positions they could engage with, and concerns they could not dismiss as procedurally baseless. We were comprehensible. In a galaxy full of civilizations, comprehensibility is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the foundation of everything that can come after. The Council called what happened a diplomatic breakdown. I understand why. From their perspective, an emerging presence that refuses to sign a standard framework within the expected timeline is a deviation, a friction point, an anomaly to be resolved. But we called it a pause. And we were right. Because what happened in the pause is where the real work was done. The reading, the questioning, the finding of the right language in their own foundational documents to make our case on grounds they could not ignore. We were not the first species to sit in that observer gallery. We will not be the last. But we may be the first to have arrived prepared to be exactly what we are, and to have held that position, quietly and completely, until the process caught up to us.